I am the cane that guided Napoleon Bonaparte's last escape from Elba, 100 days. I remember the first time he held me, February 3rd, 1815. The winter air on Elba Island was crisp, carrying salt from the Tyrrhenian Sea. His hands were not as steady as they once were. Those same hands that had once directed armies across Europe now trembled slightly as they gripped my silver handle. I was crafted from dark walnut wood, polished to a gentle shine, with a silver handle bearing a small eagle, a subtle reminder of former glory. Napoleon Bonaparte was not the giant of a man I had expected. At 45, exile had diminished him somewhat, though his eyes retained that piercing quality written about in history books. He paced the small study of his Villa dei Mulini in Portoferraio, leaning on me more heavily than his pride would have allowed others to notice. "We shall not die here forgotten," he whispered to himself that evening. I felt his grip tighten. 10 months of exile had been enough. I had been a gift from his loyal general, Drew, one of the few who had followed him into exile. For support. "On your walks, sire," Drew had said, offering me with a bow, but we both knew I would serve a greater purpose. In those final weeks on Elba, I became his constant companion. Together we walked the shoreline, climbed the hills overlooking the Elba, and stood in silence watching the horizon toward France. With each step, I felt his resolve strengthen. I was no longer just a walking aid, but a confidant of sorts, the silent witness to his whispered plans. During evening meetings with his most trusted officers, I would rest against his chair as they plotted in hushed tones. Maps spread across. Tables, coded messages exchanged, loyalties confirmed. The British Commissioner, Sir Neil Campbell, had sailed to Livorno on February 16th, leaving the harbour less guarded. Napoleon's opportunity was approaching. The night before our departure, he took me to the highest point on the island. The moonlight cast long shadows as we looked toward France, just 160 miles away. The silver eagle on my handle caught the lunar glow as he turned me in his hands. "They think me finished," he said to the night. "They believe the eagle's talons have been clipped." I felt a subtle vibration through my wooden core, not from his trembling, but from his certainty. Standing there, leaning upon me, he was no longer the exiled emperor, but once again the strategist, the commander, the man who had redrawn the maps of Europe. Come morning, we would embark on what history would call the audacious 100 days, his final gamble for glory. And I, a simple cane of walnut wood and silver, would help guide him there. The early morning of February 26, 1815, brought with it a gentle fog that clung to the harbour of Portoferraio like a conspiratorial friend. I could feel Napoleon's heartbeat through his grip as we boarded the brig L'Inconstant. His small flotilla, 7 ships carrying just over 1,000 men, represented the entirety of his remaining military force, a shadow of the 500,000 who had once marched under his command to Moscow. The sailors moved with practiced silence, canvas unfurling like whispers above us. As we pulled away from the harbour, I noticed Napoleon's knuckles whiten around my handle. For a brief moment, doubt crossed his face. Was this folly or destiny? But as Elba disappeared into the mist behind us, his resolve hardened once more. The Mediterranean showed us unexpected kindness those first days. I remained at Napoleon's side on the quarterdeck, witnessing hurried consultations over maps and telescopes scanning the horizon for British warships. The Emperor slept little, preferring instead to stand at the rail, leaning upon me as he contemplated the coast of France growing ever closer. On February 28th, our small vessel encountered the French ship Zephyr. I felt Napoleon's body tense, ready for confrontation. We had not enough men or arms to survive a proper naval battle. Instead, he ordered his grenadiers to hide below deck while he stood. with me as his only visible support, seemingly just an aging man with his walking stick. What news from Paris? Napoleon called across the water, casual as any merchant captain. The reply came back with no recognition of who truly asked. The Emperor remains on Elba. All is quiet. A smile played at the corners of Napoleon's lips as the ships passed without incident. That night he confided to his generals, "They do not yet know the eagle flies again." I rested against the table, absorbing their laughter, nervous yet hopeful. On March 1st, we approached the Gulf of Juan near Antibes. I had never felt Napoleon lean so heavily upon me as when we prepared to disembark. Not from physical weakness, but from the weight of history pressing down. As the small landing boats were prepared, he gathered his old guard around him. "Gentlemen," he said, "we return to France not as conquerors, but as liberators. The throne awaits its rightful occupant." I still remember the sensation of sinking into the sand as he stepped onto French soil once more. The evening air was cool against my wooden frame as Napoleon planted me firmly on the beach, looking north toward Paris, 600 miles distant. With his hand resting on my silver handle, he made a vow that sent shivers through my core. "By the time I reach the capital, my eagle shall have flown from steeple to steeple all the way to the towers of Notre Dame." The journey north from the Gulf of Juan unfolded like a dream. Each step we took on the route Napoleon, a path later named for this very journey, carried us deeper into a France that had changed in Napoleon's absence. I could feel the hesitation in his gait as we first moved inland, uncertain of the reception that awaited. At Grasse, the townspeople watched from windows and doorways, their faces unreadable. Napoleon leaned upon me more heavily that day, as though drawing strength from my solid frame. We bypassed the main road to avoid royalist strongholds, taking, instead, the arduous mountain route through the Alps. The snow-dusted paths tested even the hardiest soldiers, but I felt Napoleon's determination with each strike of my tip against the rocky ground. On March 7th, we reached Gap, where the first significant encounter awaited. A battalion of the 5th Regiment stood blocking our path, bayonets gleaming in the afternoon sun. I felt Napoleon's palm grow damp against my handle. This moment would determine everything. Silence fell as he stepped forward, using me to steady himself not from weakness, but to project dignity. He opened his greatcoat, exposing his chest to the soldiers who had once been his own. "If any among you would kill your emperor," he called out, his voice carrying across the mountain air, "here I stand." I will never forget the thunderous response, rifles cast aside, cries of "Vive l'Empereur" echoing against the mountainsides. Tears streamed down weathered faces of soldiers as they rushed to surround their returned leader. That night, as Napoleon sat by a campfire surrounded by his growing army, I rested against his knee, witness to history rewriting itself. Our arrival at Grenoble on March 7th brought similar scenes. The garrison commander had ordered the gates closed, but Napoleon approached anyway, with me as his only visible support. When soldiers peered down from the ramparts, he simply called up, "Soldiers of the 7th, do you recognize me?" The gates swung, open moments later. By Lyons on March 10th, Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVI he would bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage, had instead fallen to his knees before his former emperor, pledging his sword once more. Each day brought more defections from the Bourbon forces, swelling our numbers. Napoleon would often point with me toward Paris in the distance, a gesture that inspired his growing army. The journey that should have been a battle became instead a triumphant procession. Village after village erupted in celebration as we passed. I felt the rhythmic tap of my tip against cobblestones, country roads, and finally the highways leading to the capital. With each step, the impossible was becoming inevitable. On March 19th, as the spires of Paris appeared on the horizon, King Louis XVI fled the Tuileries Palace. The next day, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph, having not fired a single shot in his reconquest of France. As we climbed the steps of the palace he had left in exile just 11 months before, I felt his hand tremble slightly on my handle, not from age or fatigue, but from the sheer magnitude of what had been accomplished. The clock in the Tuileries Palace struck midnight, marking the beginning of June 18th, 1815. Napoleon had not slept. Rain pattered against the windows as he paced, the room leaning on me more heavily than ever before. The candlelight caught the silver eagle on my handle, casting warped shadows across maps of Waterloo, a Belgian village few had heard of, but all would soon remember. For 3 months, I had witnessed his tireless work to rebuild an empire, drafting new constitutions, rallying troops, sending diplomats to plead his case to a Europe determined to be rid of him. Through it all, I remained his silent companion, supporting his increasingly weary frame during long war councils and midnight strategy sessions. The coalition against him was formidable. British, Prussian, Russian, and Austrian armies converging on France's borders. "They fear what we represent more than our armies," he had whispered to me one night, as though I could understand. Perhaps I did. Dawn broke on June 18th with the rain still falling. Napoleon gripped me tightly as he mounted his horse for what would be his final battle. I was secured to his saddle, not needed while he rode, but never far from reach. Through my wooden form, I felt the thundering of cannon, the earth trembling beneath countless boots. When his horse became mired in mud, he dismounted and took me in hand once more. Together we surveyed the battlefield from a small rise, smoke obscuring much of the chaos, but not the gravity of what unfolded. Wellington's forces held their ground with stubborn British resolve. Blucher's Prussians arrived despite Grouchy's failure to intercept them. As evening approached, I felt something I had never sensed in Napoleon before: resignation. His final gambit, sending the Imperial Guard into the fray, had failed. These elite soldiers, who had never known defeat, were retreating. "C'est fini," he murmured, his weight pressing into my frame as we turned from the field. The journey that followed was a blur of hasty retreats and midnight councils. Paris fell on July 7th. Napoleon considered escape to America, but surrendered to Captain Maitland of HMS Bellerophon on July 15th. I remained with him through those dark days, my wooden form absorbing the salt spray as we sailed toward his final exile on St. Helena. On the windswept deck, Napoleon ran his fingers along my length one last time before I was confiscated with his other possessions. "You supported me when an empire could not," he said softly. "History will remember us differently than this moment suggests." As I was passed into the hands of a British officer, I caught a final glimpse of the Emperor, diminished yet dignified, gazing toward a horizon he would never again shape. His 100-day return had failed, but in those brief, brilliant moments, he had reminded the world that destiny sometimes rests not on the grand forces of history, but on the courage of a single individual willing to stake everything on one final chance at glory. I am but a cane of dark wood and silver, yet I carried the weight of an empire's last dream. In every museum visitor who gazes upon me today, I see the same question in their eyes. What would you risk for one more chance to rewrite your story?